Happy Friday, everybody. James Hancock here. It's been quite a while since we've tackled any Star Trek on this channel, but today we're going to be talking about Section 31, a project that's getting roundly ridiculed in pretty much every single corner of the internet. This is one of those ill-fated projects that's going to be at the top of a lot of 2025 Hall of Shame lists. I would say that it's worse than Rebel Moon, and if you follow this channel, you know I have a very low opinion of Rebel Moon. And as far as modern Star Trek is concerned, the bar is already pretty low, unless you're talking about season 3 of Picard, which I reviewed every single episode, watched it twice, was an absolute blast. But most of modern Star Trek is pretty much unwatchable. But this straight-to-streaming movie feels completely incompetent, even by the already low standards set by Alex Kurtzman and his team over at Secret Hideout over basically the last 7 or 8 years. And if Section 31 had been turned into a show as was originally planned, I probably would have taken a pass. But at 95 minutes, I figured, what the hell? Let's take the temperature of current Star Trek and just see where we stand. And if I were to try to zero in on the chief problem plaguing modern Star Trek, is that it doesn't want to be Star Trek. In every single interview with the producers and the writer and the director, everybody keeps saying things like, oh, well, we wanted to make it like Mission Impossible meets Killing Eve, or we wanted it to be Mission Impossible meets Guardians of the Galaxy. And I just want to say, how about make Star Trek meet Star Trek? Let Star Trek be Star Trek and let Guardians of the Galaxy be Guardians of the Galaxy. Let Mission Impossible be Mission Impossible. Let everything out there be its own thing, be the best version of itself that it can possibly be. And going back to basically when J.J. Abrams and Alex Kurtzman and all these people jumped on Star Trek back in 2009? I think is when they started doing Star Trek. I think the biggest problem since then is that everybody wants Star Trek to either be Star Wars or Fast and the Furious, like we saw with Star Trek Beyond, but nobody seems to want it. Nobody seems to want to let it just be the nerdiest version of Star Trek humanly possible, except for Terry Matalas with Picard season 3, where it almost seems like Alex Kurtzman took the Ferrari, crashed it into a wall, threw the keys to Terry Matalas, and said, "All right, the car is yours. See what you can do with it." And Terry Matalas managed to get the engine cranked back up and drove it a few more miles. And he wanted to do Star Trek Legacy, continuing with all the characters at the end of that season. But now he's moved on to do I think it's Magic the Gathering for Netflix. So sadly, that ship has sailed. We will never get another Terry Matalas show, or at least we won't get one anytime soon. And when you see people talking about their plans for Starfleet Academy, the next big Star Trek show, they keep saying, oh, it's going to be like Star Trek meets Harry Potter. Once again, let Star Trek be Star Trek. And for me, every Star Trek fan, depending upon their age and their taste, is going to give you a different answer for what Star Trek should be. But I grew up in the 1980s where we had good Star Trek movies and a good Star Trek show. But I think the core of Star Trek should be keep the budget small, but keep the scripts and the characters great. I feel like when you try to compete with Star Wars or you try to compete with Fast and the Furious, that's where you get into trouble. The best episodes of Star Trek and the best movies of Star Trek never had huge budgets, but they had amazing scripts and they had amazing characters. They had great military decorum. They were written by people who really understood science fiction. And I think one of the reasons this franchise has been so mismanaged in recent years is that nobody wants to actually make the next great Star Trek show or the next great Star Trek movie. And this new made-for-TV or straight-to-streaming movie for Section 31 is kind of the poster child for all the wrong impulses in the wonderful world of Star Trek these days. Because if you look at the original episodes of Deep Space Nine, where Section 31 was first introduced, it was just a guy saying really, really kind of menacing, cold, hardcore shit. But there were no big fight scenes. There were no big special effects. There was no big teams. Once again, it was very simple and back to basics, kind of black ops stuff. But the wonderful William Sadler as Luther Sloan, that is the best version of Section 31 we will ever see.
And what does Section 31 do, apart from kidnapping Starfleet officers?
We search out and identify potential dangers to the Federation.
And once identified,
we deal with them.
And it's amazing how dramatically impactful those scenes are, where you just have two guys in a room talking. But if you look back at the best episodes of Star Trek from the late 60s, or the best episodes of Next Generation, or the best episodes of Deep Space Nine, or in some cases, the best movies ever made from Star Trek, oftentimes the scenes that we remember, the scenes that really have a permanent place in our hearts, it's just great writing and great characters, and everything else is secondary. But with this new movie, Section 31, what they really want are explosions and heists and chase scenes and really, really lousy fight scenes. I know Michelle Yeoh, once upon a time, was a true martial arts expert. I mean, if you watch her movies from the 80s and 90s, it's like, God damn, like you're driving motorcycles on the moving trains and doing some crazy shit. Michelle Yeoh is a living legend from the great heyday of the golden age of Hong Kong cinema. But those days are far in the past. And the fight scenes now, the way I would characterize the fight scenes in Section 31, and there are a lot of them, slow, laborious, kind of cumbersome fight scenes that are inelegant and unexciting. And then every once in a while, the camera will do this stupid, flippy, spinny shit to try to make you think you're watching something really hardcore. Like you'll see like a labored punch and a slow kick. And it's just, the choreography is awful and the actors are uninvested. But like, oh, but it's really, really exciting. Let's flip the camera around so you feel like you've seen some really crazy shit. If you want to see some really crazy shit, go back and watch her in a 1985 action movie called Yes, Madam, where she co-stars with Cynthia Rothrock, where you will see some of the best martial arts that you've ever seen in any movie from any era, and it's just an absolute fucking blast. But that was 40 years ago. Time has moved on, and as much as we would like to believe that Michelle Yeoh is ageless and immortal, that's just not the case. But you know what? I'm jumping all over the place. Let me slow down a bit and actually try to give the basics in Section 31. I have a bad habit on this channel where when I'm reviewing a bad movie, I talk about all the good movies made by the people involved in the production as opposed to actually reviewing the movie in question. But I guess just because I love movies, so I'd rather talk about good movies than bad movies. But let's press pause on singing the praises of the great work of Michelle Yeoh in the past, and let's just talk about Star Trek Section 31. According to the data over on Wikipedia, where the official premise is former Emperor Philippa Georgiou from the Mirror Universe joined Section 31, a secret division of Starfleet tasked with protecting the United Federation of Planets through unsanctioned tactics and must face the sins of her past. But that official premise barely scratches the surface. We basically pick up with her where she's running this nightclub, which is the most boring nightclub that I've ever seen on film. It's way too well lit. The music's terrible. Nobody seems to be having any fun. Like, where's the vice? Where's the sin? In any case, some members of Section 31 come to recruit her for one last job, like, get her back in on the action. As it turns out, somebody brought this horrible weapon that she created in the Mirror Universe called the Godsend. There's all these stupid jokes about whether it's God's End or Godsend. In any event, it's basically a bomb that can kill an entire quadrant, taking out billions of people. But somehow that weapon is on the loose. And then slowly but surely we learn, and mild spoilers, or who gives a shit? The movie's so terrible. I feel like when a movie's this bad, spoilers aren't even a factor. But somebody's basically going to try and open up a portal, allowing the Terran Empire from the Mirror Universe to come into the official universe. And bad things are going to happen. And now the former emperor of the Terran Empire, now she has to stop it and try to redeem herself some way. But one of the main problems with this made-for-TV movie is that it's visibly straining so hard to be devilish fun, where you have a villain at the core with all these kind of Black Ops ne'er-do-wells doing evil things. But it's like, it wants to be naughty, it wants to be evil, but it doesn't quite have the courage of its convictions. It just comes across as pitiful and pathetic. And the sense of humor is just awful. Like, both the music as well as the jokes in this, they feel like they're like designed for 5-year-old children. Like, once upon a time, Star Trek was written by and was made for adults, people who actually liked sophisticated stories or sophisticated complex ideas. Now it's just like, oh, let's put together a team of bad guys, and then we're going to go on a heist, and then slowly but surely we'll all turn on each other, and then a few characters will survive, and they'll move on to the next mission. And all the characters just come across as like the biggest fucking dorks and the biggest fucking losers. No matter how many times they might tell each other, "You're a bad bitch." As soon as I saw the trailer last summer for Section 31, and I heard that line, "You're a bad bitch," as this song was saying, like, "Oh, ladies, get in formation," I was like, oh my God, this is going to be a fucking disaster.
You're a bad bitch.
We can't trust you with our lives, but here we go.
Somebody's got to keep it lively, right?
And just from that brief clip, you can see how tonally everything about this show, or everything about this made-for-TV movie, is just a complete and total creative misfire. But if I were to try to look for a silver lining in all this, perhaps some people who watch this, I don't know why, but like, I don't even know how many people are gonna watch it. If more than 200,000 people watch this, I'd be shocked and amazed. But perhaps some people will see this and say, hey, I'm going to go back and watch all the Section 31 episodes from Deep Space Nine. That might be a little confusing. It's hard to recommend that people go back and watch all of Deep Space Nine unless they're just a giant Star Trek fanatic, because it's 7 seasons. They're long seasons. But if I were to recommend a kind of a path you can take, look up a playlist of all the episodes related to the Dominion War. And some lists are more comprehensive than others. Like there's the abridged version and there's like the comprehensive version. But if you just watch all the episodes across all 7 seasons related to the Dominion War, it is some of the most fun you'll ever have watching Star Trek or science fiction. It's just an absolute fucking blast. Some of the best writing in sci-fi, some of the best acting in sci-fi. It's just awesome. I did it a couple years ago where I'd never really done the deep dive on Deep Space Nine. So I just conked out for a couple days. I was like, fuck it, we're watching the Dominion War. And I was just drooling and salivating every step of the way. And the reality is, no matter how bad modern Star Trek might be, we've got so many incredible episodes and so many incredible movies across so many decades. You could basically spend several weeks straight watching nothing but great Star Trek and ignore all the bad stuff and have an incredible time. So the legacy will live on. It's just such a shame that so many half-assed storytellers or so many incompetent storytellers and just so many mediocre talents have attach themselves like ticks to the franchise, and they just won't go away. And who knows, maybe David Ellison, who's taking over Paramount, maybe he'll just clean house, fire everybody, and start from scratch. But maybe it's just time also for Star Trek to go bye-bye. And as I was watching Section 31, I just kept thinking to myself about that classic SNL sketch from the 1980s when William Shatner gives a stern talking to everybody at this Trekkie convention about how they need to get a life. And
what have you done with yourselves? You must be almost 30. Have you ever kissed a girl?
But as funny as that sketch might be, I'm not above getting invested in this crap. I do dip in and out of modern Star Trek, even though I dislike it, because every once in a while you'll get something like Season 3 of Picard, which I think is the best example of modern Star Trek. So clearly it's still possible for amazing things to happen in the wonderful world of Star Trek. And I know a lot of people are going to say, well, what about Star Trek Strange New Worlds? That show fucking rules. I have friends who love it. I have friends who defend it. I fucking hate Star Trek Strange New Worlds. Every time Kirk and Spock open their mouths in Season 1, I was like, I would rather do anything on planet Earth than watch Star Trek Strange New Worlds. I fucking despise that show. And if you love it, more power to you. I watched half of Season 1 and I bailed, and I ain't coming back. Unless they just release like a standalone movie like this where the time investment is minimal. But life is short and shows are long, and I just don't feel like you need to, invest but so many hours into something that's giving you no pleasure or no joy. And also I feel like for all this nerdy shit that we're into, I'm wearing a Dungeons and Dragons shirt. If you invest a lot of time of your life into these nerdy pursuits, whether it's D&D or video games or Star Trek or whatever, I feel like it's more important than ever as time goes by to maintain high standards. Like if you're going to get completely worked up about certain franchises, I feel like it's better to spend your time, your most precious resource, on that which is the best example of that franchise. Like right now I'm reading From Russia With Love by Ian Fleming, and it's my favorite of the Bond novels so far. It's the 5th sequentially in the books, but I'm just absolutely loving it. I could sit around talking about how I think Amazon's going to absolutely just destroy that franchise moving forward, or I can focus on the stuff that matters, like the original novels by Ian Fleming. And getting back to Section 31, I could just have the world's biggest temper tantrum talking about how the jokes suck, the performances suck, the characters suck, the fights suck, everything about it completely, totally fucking sucks. And I know that's an inelegant term, but sometimes you just have to call it out. It fucking sucks. And it's just been a relief to see that a lot of, media outlets that might have been inclined to defend Star Trek in the past are willing to concede, it just fucking sucks. There's nothing more to say. So instead, I just choose to focus on the positive. And the reality is we got really fucking lucky where from the late 60s through basically the early 2000s, we had a lot of great Star Trek. I've never seen a single episode of Enterprise, and my understanding is that the 4th season is outstanding. And I'm kind of saving it for a rainy day because I think the opportunities to see new Star Trek that's good are going to be few and far between, but I've always got Enterprise ready and waiting for me when I want to kind of rip off that Band-Aid and dive in. And there's another part of me that's a little more cold and clinical that will always be interested in franchise management and franchise mismanagement. One of the things that makes film and television so fascinating is that it's high risk, high reward. The stakes are incredibly high. These projects are incredibly expensive. And so when projects fail, they fail in spectacular fashion, and it's fun to discuss. And when a project succeeds, they are fun to discuss. But I think of all the franchises right now over the last 10 years that have been mismanaged the most, Star Trek's not the worst, because at least we got Season 3 of Picard, which was a fucking blast. Probably The Lord of the Rings has been mismanaged the most by Amazon. I mean, Marvel's had a lot of turkeys, DC's had a lot of turkeys, Star Wars has had a lot of turkeys. Like most franchises, pretty much all franchises, whether it's Alien or Planet of the Apes or James Bond, like any franchise you care to mention that's been around for decades, they've all been mismanaged with the occasional rare exception, which gives us all joy. But if there's a common through line through a lot of these failures in franchise mismanagement, usually it's an attempt to turn the franchises into something that they're not. And obviously, franchises can't remain stagnant. But like the reason people still read Greek myths thousands of years later is because they're immortal and they go on forever, and they're just like they're these classic tales of high adventure. I mean, Christopher Nolan is making the Odyssey, and I suspect it'll be more or less a faithful interpretation of the Odyssey, which is right up here on my bookshelf. And Star Trek should always remain true to its roots. I mean, if you watch the best episodes of the original series and the best movies, I mean, they would just fill you with joy every single time. So I just feel like there should be like a Star Trek boot camp for anybody who's coming on board the franchise as a writer or director. Like the same way Nicholas Meyer, he made Wrath of Khan. He was not a big giant Trekkie, but he did his homework. He watched every single episode of the show, I think every single episode of the animated series from the early 70s, and he obviously saw Star Trek the Motion Picture, and then he was ready to rock, and he gave us two of the best Star Trek movies, Wrath of Khan and The Undiscovered Country. And I feel like he is one of the best examples of somebody who comes to the franchise with no preconceived notions, tries to understand what makes it tick, and then do the best version of Star Trek humanly possible. And with Section 31, it just feels like they were trying to make a lame ripoff of Guardians of the Galaxy with humor that feels like it's like a piss-poor imitation of the humor you might find in a show like Buffy the Vampire Slayer. That's probably a big problem with a lot of the writers on a lot of these big franchises now, is that they only know film and television, but they don't have any knowledge outside of that. I feel like, read some great science fiction books, or join the military, or take some science classes, but develop some other interests and then bring those into Star Trek, as opposed to just constantly either trying to like riff on details from the past or like rip off other more successful franchises. So yeah, everything about Section 31 is just as bad as you've heard. I don't think you can even really watch it and just like kind of like laugh at its expense and have a good time. It's just a soul-sucking, depressing experience. And the only positive news is that it's 95 minutes long, so you're in and out really, really quickly. So your pain and misery will be I won't say short and sweet, but at least it'll be brief. So I don't know if Section 31 will end up being the worst movie of 2025, but it'll do as a placeholder until the worst movie of 2025 finally arrives. And I suspect that if Alex Kurtzman remains part of Star Trek moving forward, every show or movie that they do will be equally bad or almost as bad. He needs to bring in some other creators like Terry Matalas who actually know what the fuck they're doing, and give them the autonomy and the room with which to work, so they're not constantly getting infected by the Kurtzman approach. But moving forward, I suspect that Star Trek Starfleet Academy will be one of the worst shows ever made. And then hopefully, finally, now that Paramount is under new management and has merged with Skydance, perhaps finally David Ellison will say, what the fuck is going on with this historic brand that goes back nearly 60 years? Can't we get some quality storytellers in there? Or, I know this is unfathomable, hire some writers to create some new franchises that are inspired by their love of Star Trek, but boldly go in their own direction and give us some new science fiction stories to get excited about for the next 50 or 60 years, as opposed to constantly digging up the bones of Star Trek. Just let it remain dead and buried and move on and create some new shit that is just as fresh and exciting now as Star Trek was in the late 60s. But I think at this point, I have rambled enough about this. It's time to move on. Hope everybody has a great weekend. Please remember to like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, but more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.